Good evening, everyone. This is Dawn. I'm the Education Chair of ASQ Innovation Division, and on behalf of ASQ Innovation Division, I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, and I hope you are all keeping safe and staying healthy. The topic of tonight's webinar is Disruptive Innovation within Professional Services. Many professional firms have done little to address the opportunities and threats presented by potentially disruptive technology, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning. By applying established frameworks, organizations can better align their offensive and defensive strategies related to the system effects of disruptive technologies on their organizations. In this webinar, the ways in which technology can disrupt an entire business ecosystem, the benefits of leveraging sustaining technologies to reduce waste related to non-advisory outputs, and the benefits of engaging in proactive innovation generation will be discussed. The learning objectives are what is disruptive innovation and how it is different from other forms of innovative strategies, such as incremental or sustaining innovation. Cutting through the hype, how to differentiate between innovation products and marketing hyperbole, how to foster disruptive thinking within the organization. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on ASQ Innovation Division YouTube channel. In addition, there will be 5 to 10 minute time after the presentation for questions and answers. Please post your questions in the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. Tonight, our speaker is Dr. Donald Billings. Dr. Donald Billings has led business process and technology innovation at global law firms, nonprofit organizations, and Fortune 100 companies over a 20-year career in leadership, consultative, and entrepreneurial roles. After graduating with a degree in computer science from Touro College, Dr. Billings went on to earn PG status from both Villanova and Tulane University. He also holds both Masters in Leading Innovation and Technology and a Doctorate in Technology Entrepreneurship from Walden's College of Management and Technology, where his research focused on disruptive innovation in the legal services ecosystem. Dr. Billings is currently experimenting with the application of data science, AI, and machine learning on legal operations through IBM's Cognitive Solutions Institute. Thank you very much, Dr. Billings, for accepting to be our speaker tonight. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to you. Dr. Billings, please take it away.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. Let me see if I can get my... What did I lose here? Sorry, bear with me just a second.
The screen share.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it. There it is. Okay, try it again. Screen two. Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. So today we're going to talk a little about, as Don mentioned, disruptive innovation in the professions. And I'm framing this through the outcomes of a doctoral study I conducted over the course of 6 years. They're really focused on disruptive innovation in law firms, as well as the relationship to professional services firms as a whole. So you may ask, why does that matter? And that's a really great question. And if you're at all like me, I'm sure many of you have grown a bit weary of reading or hearing the term disruption thrown around, especially in the popular press, to describe anything that's new or novel. It seems that, every time you look at an ad nowadays, people are trying to talk about how they're disrupting a market, and 80%, 90% of the time, that's marketing hyperbole. During my academic residencies, the question came up as to why anyone would really care about law firms as a business. And after all, they would remark, doesn't the world have enough lawyers or more than it needs? And I will say at some level, I think we would all tend to agree with that statement. But in practice, like many of the professions, much of the legal ecosystem is really a profit-chasing enterprise. And so what does that mean in practical terms? Well, if we look at a firm such as Sidley, where I'm currently employed, you might find a firm that presently surpasses annual revenues of about $2.5 billion, and that's with a B. And those numbers around direct revenue do not account for ancillary economic activity related to mergers and acquisitions work, intellectual property litigation, tech transactions, maybe ECVC startup work, which in turn also yields billions of dollars a year in economic activity. So, it's a pretty big space, at least when it comes to revenue numbers. Unfortunately, those rosy economic figures can mask some underlying structural weaknesses with firms as a whole. And I think, unfortunately, we're really starting to see this play out again during COVID-19, where a not insignificant number of firms have announced recently that they're cutting salaries, furloughing personnel, or closing their doors altogether. And so I assume that most of the folks attending this webinar are familiar with Clay Christensen, who we unfortunately lost earlier this year. He developed the seminal work formalizing the concept of disruptive innovation more than 2 decades ago. And surprisingly, given how long ago he established this theory, it's only been as recently as 2015 that leaders at many of these large firms have begun recognizing the role disruptive innovation may be playing within the larger legal ecosystem. And in that space, only a small number have really taken formal steps to address disruption at all. This lack of action continues despite a growing consensus among scholars that disruption within the legal industry is inevitable. And we'll talk about some of the products we're seeing come to market now, but you're seeing things like contract management, clause assembly, document review using AI, while not necessarily resulting in full displacement of either lawyers or other personnel, you are seeing a shift in maybe the number of people you need to do a certain task. So if I were to look at the e-discovery world, for example, 10 years ago, or maybe a little longer, if you had a big sort of large litigation case, it wasn't unusual to have an entire warehouse of banker boxes where folks would have to go in, sit in chairs, take little tags and stick them on each document. And then if any of the issues changed in the case, you'd have to go through those boxes again. Well, now you can take, 2 subject matter experts, sit them down with a machine learning module and have them train the data set, and you might get through the same number of materials in a week with, 3 or 4 people. And so between 2006, roughly, and 2016, U.S. corporations reduced their spending on outside legal services. And that trend corresponded with an increased client-driven demand for greater operational efficiency and more metrics. For people who may not be familiar with the way law practice works, and it's not dissimilar to many consultancies or accounting practices, the billable hour is still pretty much the gold standard. And so in some places you may see what they would call alternative billing arrangements, where people try to model a kind of a final cost for a litigation or for an M&A, but by and large, people are still doing things with billable hours. And in my experience, for the most part, I think people try to be as honest as possible when they're billing their time. But you can imagine the inefficiencies if you have 12 people working on a case, they're all billing, they're all doing different things. Trying to really come up with a stable budget becomes much more difficult. And in rough economic times, outside corporations really don't want the $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a month spend on legal services. So they were really at that time trying to look at ways to improve efficiency. Sorry about that. So the innovation challenges facing professional services organizations really first presented themselves following the economic downturn of 2008, when professional services leaders in the United States experienced significant increases in pressure related to improving the operational efficiency we talked about before. And, the failure to implement those strategies combined with other issues, and I'll pause here for a second and give a little background. A lot of firms, and not all, but a lot of them are highly leveraged. And so when you are being pushed by counsel or outside counsel to improve your efficiency or to add new technologies in a downturn, it can put the firm in a very bad place because that obviously will result in a hit to revenue. It was a big enough hit for a lot of firms that during that period, more than 25 U.S.-based law firms, some of which had been in business since the mid-1800s, completely closed their doors. And we're talking, firms of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people in global markets. One that jumps to mind for me is Heller Ehrman. It was a great firm. They were the counsel for Levi Strauss, and I think we lost them right around 2008. So they went just completely out of business. And as we looked at this problem, we found that many professional leaders in the U.S. lacked any real strategy to address potentially negative systems effects of things like disruptive technology. People are, of course, using the right buzzwords, but the measures around their outcomes were just completely different than the story their metrics were telling. And again, part of this is a technology problem. The other part of this is more of what I would say is a cultural problem. I often joke with the firm I work at where there are, we have, I think, close to 5,000 employees, a large number of partners, all of whom feel like they're the boss of the organization, despite the fact that there's a structure and a management committee and a CEO. Anybody who's a partner at a firm obviously has a strong voice. And so trying to sort of rein in the various cultures from different offices and different personalities to present a unique problem in law firms that you might not see in other kind of like consultancies, that you might not see in other types of businesses. And so the question we tried to answer with the research was around the strategies these firms use to stave off any potential detrimental influences related to disruptive innovations. And so, we wanted to know, hey, what were they doing that was specific to disruption that wasn't anything related to, say, blue ocean strategy or any of the other kind of strategic frameworks that one might look at when looking at the competitive market. And so when we conduct this type of research, we typically analyze the problem through the lens of either a conceptual or theoretical framework. And for those who are interested, there are virtually hundreds of frameworks to choose from, and there are several websites that include a listing of most, along with a summary related to how you might apply one of those frameworks in a study, even if you're just doing a kind of a simple case study within your organization. For this particular study, we chose to explore the problem through the lens of the systems approach to management, a framework designed to guide practitioners and to optimize decision-making within an organization. And for background, this is a subvariant of GST, or General Systems Theory. The challenge with applying GST relates to the number of subvariants, which is hundreds. There were also several versions of systems-related theories proffered in parallel back in the 1960s, and these theories were actually independent of one another. So you'll go back to, say, 1963 to 1966, and you may find 3 or 4 different versions of systems theory. So it really requires narrowing down how you are applying systems theory to your process. And so for this study, we looked to the definition proffered by Katz and Kahn in 1966. And under the systems approach to management, external influences from stakeholders such as customers, competitors, government entities, and suppliers are important. Inputs from stakeholders and outputs from organization to the stakeholders is important. And then internal processes that apply the information and create outputs, kind of really defining the framework we're looking at when addressing these issues. So we might want to know, is law an open or closed system? And we'll get to that later. I think, we determined that for the most part, parts of it are open, but at sub-levels, they really become closed systems. And that's largely because law firms tend to not share with one another, so you don't see the kind of collaboration that you might see in, say, the tech industry. People tend to keep their strategies a little closer to the vest. You'll also find, though, that as you get into sub-departments, at least historically, most of those groups, let's say you're in IT, you're in accounting, some firms now have innovation groups, they tended to be siloed. And so that's where the challenges really come in. And so there was a book written in 1996 regarding ways in which you could apply systems theory to the practice of law. And what we really found was that the complexity of practice of law could be viewed in the professions of broader ecosystems through the systems analysis. So you might have the law firm as part of a system, but that's only one node. You also have the courts, you have corporations that are feeding, and as that branches out, you start seeing these permeable bubbles where, yes, these organizations are self-contained, but they influence one another fairly significantly. And the data analysis for this research, pardon me, a little water here, relied on a mix of inductive and deductive coding. And so to back up, for this study design, it was a qualitative design. When we first put the study together, we looked at doing quantitative, maybe doing things with Likert scales and sending people surveys, but we decided the case study method worked a lot better in a qualitative format. And what I mean by that is we were able to go out, meet with people or call them up on the phone, provide them in advance with very open-ended questions. So, questions you couldn't answer with yes or no. They really required putting some thought into what your response was. And we did that live so we could kind of suss out further responses to get more follow-up. And what you're looking for when you're using qualitative data is really the richness of the experience from the participants. So, if John Doe is sitting across from you and fidgeting a little and, you can tell he's uncomfortable with a question, you might ask, is this question making you uncomfortable? Is there another way you'd like to describe what's happening? And if you spend enough time with people, you really, really get some kind of very deep answers to your questions. And I will say that scholars have also recommended this use of kind of data collection through interviews as a primary capture device. We also do things like triangulate the data by grabbing what we call artifacts. And so when you meet with the participant, you ask them to bring in any materials they think are pertinent to the discussion. And in this study, it was really interesting. We had a few people bring in things like articles on disruptive innovation and, competitor files where they might have been looking what was going on with another firm, what they were doing. So people were starting to think about this problem, but the response just hadn't quite matured yet. So based on the analysis, really 4 key themes emerged. And the first was law is really an open system. And so responses indicated that study participants agreed that the legal system as a whole is open and as such, subject to external influences. So that would be, as we spoke about earlier, technology vendors, clients, government agencies, maybe the regulatory environment is going to have a really big impact on what you're able to do from a strategic standpoint. One of our participants described the inputs from clients and government agencies that drive a significant portion of the firm's strategy. And so it may be that, especially at large law firms, if we have a case involving the Department of Justice and they've moved to a new analytics tool for analyzing electronic evidence, that's really going to push people to adopt. And so you see some adoption for that, but just not enough to drive an overall strategy. So, when you see that, it's more of a piecemeal approach, but they're still bringing in innovative products. So it's a step. The collected surveys and deployment documentation provided by one of our participants pointed to the external influences of clients as a driving force behind DT adoption. And that was a theme echoed by the other study participants. And when you look at clients driving innovation at a law firm, I think one of the best examples I can think of is in about roughly 2011, I believe, the then general counsel for Kia Motors had started calling people in to do their beauty contests live. And so for those who are not familiar with how law firms go about, or corporate law firms go about getting business, they are often invited to participate in, which is very much sort of an RFA process. And so people go in and they give presentations, or at times they send over written responses that somebody looks at. This gentleman at Kia Motors did things a little differently. And so what he did is he invited all the participants in to be in the spot live, and he asked that one of their senior associates come with them. And when they arrived, he would do things like give folks an Excel test. Now, if you've ever been inside a law firm, there is a spectrum of skills on the technology spectrum. And so you'll find people who have been in practice for years and years and years and have moved away from technology. But even when we were looking at bringing millennials in who had obviously used a lot of these tools in college, we found a lot of differences in the various skills people had with regard to technology. And I just thought that was brilliant that, he made his decisions on basically how efficient the law firm was going to be. If this person wasn't going to use, say, Excel or much more advanced tools, they didn't want to pay for someone to put tables together in Word or, do things kind of longhand, which weren't necessary. All 6 participants in the study also described experiencing at least some challenges related to flow and synergy at the departmental or subsystem level. And this is, as I mentioned before, where departments or functions and personnel often operate in isolation, limiting the exchange of ideas and resources. So, that is not what we would call a systems thinking environment in which, if anyone's ever read kind of the pulp culture business books from Peter Senge, you get everybody in the room and you get everyone to share ideas, and you really want to share both idea and innovation generation across the entire vertical of the organization, as opposed to just in some subgroup dedicated to developing innovation. By doing so, you really allow for more diversity of thought, and you allow people with domain expertise in their specific area to come in and actually come up with ideas that I can build a database for you or a data warehouse. But if I'm not a domain expert in your area, it's probably not going to be that useful. So that was one thing that people found really, really challenging. The participants also lamented a lack of synergy among departments to move past local system boundaries. So this again goes to, you do see some firms getting together, we'll speak at, say, Relativity Fest, or we'll get together and speak at Legal Tech. But folks really, really, really kind of keep their organizational strategies close to the vest. And some of us, I think, have been trying to find ways in which we could anonymize data and share certain data sets in a way, say, around e-discovery, that makes everybody's job more efficient. The competitive nature of law practice, I think, has really been a hindrance in that regard. But I think as, the financial aspects and the economies of scale come to be, you're going to see more people opening up to those ideas. And things I'm talking about are, let's say, in a electronic evidence database, you might want to share certain metrics related to certain metadata fields, even like global things like what's the average size of a Word document. And you see people doing these studies, but they're very limited. It's usually on, some homogeneous data set that they have internally. We really think there's ways that you might be able to harness all of that knowledge and share it in a way that helps most of the firms fairly equally. One of the participants described solutions to these challenges, including improving cross-boundary activity for both developing and deploying these type of solutions by leveraging tools outside of their intended purposes. So, for example, you might have a product and this is what's common in the legal field right now. There are these sort of siloed products, so there's not much interoperability. But you might take something like a machine learning tool for electronic evidence or e-discovery and apply that to, say, the due diligence portion of an M&A, because these tools have things like clustering and unsupervised learning that can really streamline those processes. And so by exploiting tools that are not being used for their intended purposes, I think you were seeing some innovation kind of adoption that way. Okay. And so the second theme was really that acknowledging that while disruptive technology represents the most significant potential challenge in the near future, really the more immediate challenge is related to incrementally improving technology that requires organizational adjustments. And so the participants agreed that current technologies, while innovative, were really just augmenting the work of lawyers and professional staff at firms. So, for example, one participant pointed out that, displacement of personnel involved in these now commoditized tasks has led to opportunities elsewhere in the organization. So, like I said previously, you may have seen us, I oversee an umbrella group, and one of the groups I oversee are the paralegals, patent agents in that group. 5–10 years ago, I think I had, 35 people in those groups. I have about 8 now. And, most of that wasn't a matter of we had to go out and fire people because we had new technologies. I think you can kind of do that with natural attrition, and the people who really want to embrace technology, they flourish. People who don't want to embrace in technology, they typically tend to find opportunities elsewhere. It's just not going to be a good fit for them. But along with that displacement, I think we saw a growth in the creation of new positions in the law firm. So, you have technologists, we have data scientists, statisticians, we have people, a department that I work with that does data visualization. I have an entire group I oversee that does social media investigations, and as part of that, you're doing some big data polls, putting that into a small data mart, and then presenting that maybe for use as evidence later, or for a presentation to a client, or for some kind of opposition research. But so we're seeing a lot more kind of interesting roles being created. And, if we're being perfectly honest, maybe 1 or 2 people really want to do a job where they're shuffling paper all day, but most people, I think, in their careers want to be challenged. And so, that's one area that we see as really a positive. The participants also expressed some skepticism over how deeply their competitors were innovating through the deployment of disruptive technologies. Participants cited frequently the marketing hyperbole often used to describe technologies or trends in industry seminars and workshops. And so you will see people saying like, oh, this product is disruptive, or we're using AI, which, kind of a funny story, and I won't give the name of the company. In the social media collection space, I reached out to an organization that said they specialized in this and tried to get together a competitive bid so I could decide whether to build this department internally, or maybe we just outsourced it. Maybe that made the most sense. If this was their cup of tea, we didn't have to kind of train people up. That might be more efficient. And what I found over the course of the negotiations was really that they couldn't give me a bottom line price, no matter how much I tried to simplify the model. Well, it turned out about 6 months later, that organization was sued by a whistleblower, and what they were calling AI was a bunch of low-paid workers sitting in a back room who were actually manually downloading social media content and flagging it. So a very, very good example of marketing hyperbole. And we see that a lot really with like machine learning or with AI. There are other products out there that are sophisticated. They are what I would call very smart decision trees. And you have people marketing that as AI, and I think they just hope that lawyers won't understand what they're talking about, and move on and purchase their product. So theme 3 was really around innovation generation. And so in discussing disruptive technology strategies and challenges in their organization, the participants described the need to formally drive internal innovation strategy through external partnerships, dedicated internal departments, or through wholly owned subsidiaries focused on the development of innovative products. And so you are seeing some of this now. I recently spoke at UC Hastings at LexLab, and that's a really fantastic example of what we're now starting to see in what we call the legal tech space. And it basically serves as a legal incubator. So folks, the students can attend a class on innovation, which is nice. That means, you know, in the coming years, we're going to have people who are at least familiar with kind of the frameworks around innovation moving into law firms. But what they also do is bring in a lot of fledgling legal tech startups. And so these folks are really fun to talk to. They're generally people with law degrees who have gone out and learned how to code. They've hired a few people, and they're developing, you know, really cool products. And through their alumni relationships, they're able to then reach out to law firms and get these folks kind of FaceTime with folks like me or other people who work on procuring legal technology. The other area that I thought was interesting was that they were seeing an increased focus on incorporating innovation strategy into new practice areas and less on technology solutions. So there are a couple of firms, and one, we kind of quote their material in the study, that develop practices that help other firms kind of sell their innovations to work through the innovation life cycle. And so the law firm then is acting as more of a consultancy with these organizations. And I thought that was a really kind of novel way of approaching this. They also described what I talked about earlier, these legal incubators, but maybe within their own organization. And so there are a couple of places, or a couple of firms, a handful now, where you now see chief innovation officers. You know, I think the forecast for that role becoming common is mixed. I think some people think that's a great kind of role to have in firms. At others, you know, they might view it as purely overhead and not really look at the long-term kind of benefit of the products that are being developed. And I think the bigger concern as we're heading into another recession now is that those non-sort of revenue-related positions, if there's a downturn, almost every firm cuts those roles first. So I think, you know, you may see people over the next year or so backing away from some of those roles, and then as economic activity picks up, kind of moving back in. The other thing they complained about was something I mentioned earlier, was innovation taking place in siloed departments. And so, you know, whether it be the knowledge management group in the firm rolling out something, or, you know, my group that does kind of legal technology on the litigation side, or IT wants to roll out a product, at a lot of firms, folks are just not talking to each other. And that's unfortunate because, again, if you look at using tools for a secondary kind of output, that's the way that gets done. You get people in a room, you allow them to talk, but departments at firms still tend to be fairly siloed. The other thing was to partner with vendors or others outside the traditional law firm environment. We do see some firms now spinning off wholly owned subsidiaries that do some innovation development. Others are partnering with kind of technology vendors for white label solutions. So you are seeing some of that. You're also seeing firms like ours that'll take, say, a product like Relativity and develop our own applications to run around it or within it. So we're able to build our own innovation in small increments into established tools. That really speeds up the innovation process. You're not, you know, sitting down at square one, coming up with a technology budget, trying to push that through. Instead, you can look at things a little more holistically by partnering with someone that also works in this space. I think, you know, again, law firms keeping things close to the vest, there's a hesitancy to do that in some circumstances, only because there's this fear that somebody may kind of share those ideas. And I had that experience early on when I joined my current firm, where we sat down with a technology vendor, and I was talking through some old time and motion studies I had done at my previous firm, and they were looking to contract to us, but I noticed they started taking copious notes, and we got a little concerned that they were going to take the ideas gleaned from us and pass those on to our competitors. So there are some real kind of fears there. Excuse me. Oh, so the next category that they pointed to for theme 4 was really around what we'll call non-advisory outputs. And so in a law firm, really what you want is for the senior partners and the associates to be able to bill time. What you want to reduce is anything unrelated to these non-advisory outputs. So that might be if you have to spend a lot of time on accounting, if you have to spend a lot of time entering your time. A lot of us often joke that in the legal environment, you spend as much time describing what you did as actually billing for the project. So that can be a big challenge. But anything that is not the direct result of advisement is really ripe for innovation. And so one participant described how business process automation software can automate routine sub-processes in a manner that allow the practitioner and automated systems to operate as a seamless unit. And these systems are not intended to replace human output, but instead automate specific routine tasks at various stages in the process. And while doing so, that improves overall quality and standardizes flow. It brings a lot of other advantages aside from just pure cost savings, which is obviously also important. Another participant also described several augmenting technologies that have been deployed within the organization during the previous 2 years. One for transactional closings, another that automated legal research, one for contract drafting, and even a lot of predictive or prescriptive technologies as opposed to things that are just descriptive. And, to support those claims, I think some of the artifacts really came to be helpful. So they handed over documentation from a company called Doxley. Doxley basically automates the transactional closing process. And so when you look at a lot of firms, when you have these really big transactions, they often involve, several lawyers at the firm along with members at various banks and the client. And so there is a lot of this creating signature packets, say in Word, putting those in an email and sending those off to folks, and then, trying to keep track of when signatures came back and who had received packets, had they opened it. And so there's really, again, that's an area of non-advisory work, right? That you're spending 80% of your time almost managing the process. So what Doxley did is they came up with a platform that builds the signature pages automatically. It sends them out via distribution. It tracks their return via what I like to call a traffic light system. And so at any time during the transaction, instead of digging through one's email, you can go back and look at this dashboard and say, hey, we've gotten 22 of the 24 signature packets back, and this one needs to be back like in an hour, and they haven't gotten back to us, so we need to remind them. There are also things like Kira, BrainSpace for data visualization and analytics, Kara AI, and that's just to name a few. Another participant expanded on this theme, citing both augmenting and incremental innovation as a core strategy for addressing disruption. And they really pointed to improved synergies among lawyers, technologists, and tools to provide a significant competitive advantage. So instead of just sticking it, you will see this at a lot of firms too. They'll say, hey, we've rolled out this innovative product. And so what they've basically done is taken a piece of software, regardless of how smart this software is, they've deployed it on their network, and then they've just said to the lawyers, good luck, here's a new tool, I hope you use it. what this participant was describing is really getting all these people in the room, talking to each other, strategizing, and not just on a more kind of global strategic scale, but on a case-by-case scale, so that you can sit down and actually architect something specific to whatever complex matter you're working on, instead of doing the kind of round hole square peg sort of thing. And I will say that 66% of the participants really cited incremental innovation as a core element of long-term strategy. So while, the disruptive innovation may seem to some to be kind of the sexy target, really the, boiling frog incremental innovation is much easier to push through in a law firm environment, especially if you have lawyers that aren't super technical. If you stage kind of innovations into current products, that tends to be more consumable in smaller bites. One participant acknowledged that a core challenge to addressing potential disruption was really a lack of, for lack of a better word, I'll say clarity within the ecosystem around the definition of disruption. And that goes back to my original point that, Christensen had a very specific definition of disruption at the bottom of the market in areas where maybe larger organizations didn't feel they needed to have a product, and then they are able to, get their innovation started, but then encroach on the business of law firms. And so where you might see this is, I would say, in the LPO or legal process operations, the LPO market. And so a lot of these are outsourced organizations that do a lot of back-end work for law firms. So maybe accounting for some firms, their HR functions. Maybe they host their databases for e-discovery. And the largest of these companies, are primarily located in India, but we're also seeing a growth of these types of services in places like Wheeling, West Virginia. I think, the challenge really becomes, how are we defining disruption? If we're saying this new tool is disruptive just because it's kind of cool and it's got great features, that doesn't mean anything. The other side of that, though, is, and it's one of the reasons I didn't use Christensen's theory as a framework, there have been some challenges to the way in which he has framed disruption. I think there was an article in 2015 that came out and said, yeah, we think your theory is bunk. And it actually forced Christensen to come out, write a rebuttal, and then augment his theories a little bit more. And again, it's a shame he died earlier this year, because I think there was some really exciting work that could be done in this new disruptive environment. The other thing he really missed the mark on, I think, back at the time was iPhone. He didn't think the iPhone was disruptive, but at that time, too, I think his analysis was, well, it's a phone, it's disrupting phones. It didn't occur to him that it might disrupt things like computers or any other kind of communication devices that people used at home and replace them with something you can carry in your hand. Because I think once we saw things like the iPhone or the iPad and other kinds of tablets rolling out, a lot of people really turned away from PC and Mac purchases and moved to those products. So there were some criticisms of just how Christensen looked at that theory. And so there were really 4 recommendations for action. First, law firm leaders should adopt a systems approach to strategy. And what I mean by that is really making a concerted effort to track and evaluate the potential risks both outside and within their own systems. Recommendation 2, that along with analyzing, law firm leaders should conduct internal systems analysis, really looking at barriers and opportunities within the organization that might result in synergies. And I know I'm using that word too much and I hate using it, so you can bludgeon me over the head for that one. That could include items such as leveraging products outside of the organizational silo for new and unique uses, as we discussed before. Recommendation 3 was really fostering an organizational culture and policies aimed at driving innovation, going so far as to allow for experimentation within the organization. Now, this one hits really close to home for me. Especially in the big law firms, they tend to hire at the very best schools. So you've got the top 10% of the classes from the top, 10 law schools. Very, very, very bright people for the most part. They have also had perfection hammered into them over both their educational and professional careers. Where that becomes a problem is when trying to roll out innovative products. And so, what a lot of us have talked about recently in kind of group discussions about this topic is building a culture that allows for experimentation and occasional failure, and really keeping the eye on the ball and the bigger picture. So knowing that if we treat innovation development inside the organization as we would a startup, we could expect, X percentage of products to not succeed. I wouldn't really classify that as a failure, but lawyers might say that's a failure. We would say that that is actually building knowledge and allowing us to build a better product the next time around. And if you sit down at the start of a project and say, hey, we're going to allow for X amount of experimentation, I think that would really serve a law firm well. And then, strategic partnerships are also really important, and they should be considered when internal innovation development might be constrained. And so I'm fortunate to work for a very large firm. I think we're between the 5th and 10th largest, depending on whose survey you go by. And we have a fairly robust team with very dedicated or very experienced personnel. And so even within my own group that does litigation technology stuff, we have our own development team, we have our own database administrators. You might not see that in, say, a mid-sized firm where you're never going to have that kind of technical budget. Those monies are going to be used somewhere else. And, one other thing we think that is really important, finally, is embracing systems thinking, and we talked about that earlier. Really get all the people in a room to talk about what needs to get done, take ideas from across the enterprise, allow for black box suggestions if people are afraid to sort of step forward, and find the folks with domain expertise in the firm. Years and years ago, everyone would have thought it was the senior partner who had the domain expertise over everyone, because of course when you go to law school, you also become a doctor and a technologist, and I'm being facetious here, but you do have some people in the industry with that mentality. Really getting all the stakeholders in the room and leveraging that knowledge is the best approach. So I'll go ahead and pause this for questions, comments.
Yes, thank you very much again, Dr. Billings, for your presentation. So you can please post your questions in the Q&A panel of the WebEx tool. And I would remind you that you can find the recording of this webinar on ASQ Innovation Division YouTube channel. So we have 5 to 10 minutes time for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can post your questions in the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. Okay, there is one question that has been posted. What is the most difficult innovation decision you ever faced, and how did you handle it?
I think I have. it was more the result of the innovation, and for people in other industries, it may not seem all that innovative. But one of the projects I took on, I want to say 5 to 7 years ago, was taking a off-the-shelf project management tool, and I tested 20, 30 of them, most of which, for whatever reason, seemed to come out of the Netherlands. But a lot of really cool, great applications out there. And I looked at where we were having issues with consistency among practices. And so, a paralegal in one group might do things one way, a paralegal in another group might do it another. And we also had a lot of lost opportunity costs because we spent so much time training. And so I took this project management tool and broke out the top, 30 tasks that a paralegal might perform, and along with their subtasks as dependencies. And what we did is we set that up so that it was open to everyone. Okay, so law firm culture historically, very kind of private, keep it to yourself, don't share. What I had grown frustrated with is people saying, hey, I'm busy, but there was no way to track how busy they were, and other people saying I don't have enough work, and how do we even that out? And so we built this database. We gave all of the paralegals and project assistants access. We gave some of our outsourced vendors access to facilitate transfers. And for about 6 months, everyone thought it was great. I mean, initially there was some hesitation because, oh, now Johnny can see I'm not really busy even though I say I am. And the other thing I really liked about it, the particular tool we were using, I was able to kind of, over time, it would build models as to how long it would take to do things. So if someone was working on a deposition and we ended up with 500 depositions, you can kind of see, hey, prep takes 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour. At some point, though, a lawyer somewhere in the organization just got completely frustrated, probably because his paralegal went back and complained to him that he didn't like the system. And, it became a big issue. We ended up taking it down. We're now going back to kind of rolling some more of these types of tools out. And so I think in the future, I'd like to try that again, but I will say that was probably one of the most challenging events because it was also heartbreaking to take, 6 months to a year's worth of work and just scrap it completely and go back to the dark ages.
Thank you. The next question that has been posted, what is a typical goal for process improvement in reduction of hours? Some industries use 50% reduction in cycle time as a goal. What is a typical improvement goal?
Yeah, I don't think, we don't look to reduce a percentage of hours because, and again, we have this tension between the billable hour as a revenue source and then the non-advisory hour as just being a waste, right? So our goal would be to automate out anything that's non-advisory. That said, we're probably at, I think 50% is probably a good number. We're probably getting a little closer to 60. Even in our own processes, I think we spend a lot of times with BPM software looking at how many different ways we can just kind of eliminate the human touching, say, the electronic evidence. And that has other benefits with regard to quality and kind of continuous process as well.
Thank you. The next question is, what innovation trends other than Chief Innovation Officer do we need to be most aware of in 2020, 2025?
Well, I think it's the growth of all of these technical roles, right? Because when you look at innovation, there are so many different components. And so, again, we're looking at hiring data scientists. We look at hiring AI experts. We look at hiring people who do visualization. So I think anything that streamlines operations and kind of makes them more consistent across the enterprise. And, my guess is we're going to see in the next, 2025 is the way out. By 2025, there could be completely new roles that I can't even imagine right now. I know when I got into the legal field, what I'm doing now would have been a pipe dream. There was no such profession when I joined.
Thank you. So the next question is, how would you go about encouraging leaders of organizations in insular industries to benchmark outside of the industry for ideas for innovation? do you think benchmarking outside of the industry is a good approach for spurring innovation?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Obviously, you need to quantify, you'll need to be able to quantify in your benchmarking kind of the relationship, right? But maybe that is not a quantitative question. Maybe that becomes more of a qualitative question. So there are ways that you can do qualitative analysis with rigor. Again, the deduced system I showed earlier allows you to get quantified data from qualitative data. So it may be that you want to look at benchmarking, but you also want to talk to people in that organization or in that industry about how it's helped. If something on an assembly line is more efficient because they do X, that might actually translate very well to an automated business process in a law firm. So definitely beneficial.
Thanks. The next question that has been posted, what role does culture play in innovation adoption, and what is the best practice that you have used?
Yeah, I will say 90% of the challenge with innovation development is culture. I go back to my kind of description of, the law firm having 1,900 bosses, right? I think, though, if you are able to get small projects done and show wins, get successes, that really brings people on board. In the law firm environment, it's being able to show in your proposal that, hey, we think we're going to be able to cut non-advisory outputs by 40%. In another industry, it may be that, you'll be able to automate, 27 more widgets per hour or whatever it is. Being able to really focus on outcomes the stakeholders care about, that's really important. And it's also really being a good listener. So a lot of people on the call may have heard of the 5 whys from Toyota, and they walk into a room and you ask a question and there's always 5 why follow-ups. Being a good listener and asking the why questions, I think, is really a good way to get people on your side. It makes them feel like you're listening to them versus talking at them. But it's a challenge, I got to say. I mean, I still run into people who would rather just have a typewriter on their desk and not have a computer anywhere near them.
Yes, thank you. So the next question is, what can you say about tracker apps exposing user privacy information, location, etc. for COVID-19 solution?
Yeah, so that's not my area of expertise, but my wife is actually a doctor of public health, so we've been looking at some of this. Yeah, I don't have a good answer. I mean, I have real concerns, and it's a struggle because there's also really good outcomes that could come from this, right? But we already know that no matter how secure we think a system is, there is always a way to inadvertently result in a breach or, I mean, a lot of the stuff we deal with in litigation is related to data breaches, and they can be from banks or, places where you think you've got really strong encryption and somebody finds a way in through the back door. So I like the idea of tracker apps, but I also, of late we've all been seeing pushback from end users with even like Facebook, any social media accounts for things like Google tracking. So I think this one's going to be sort of a hot topic for at least the next couple of years.
Thanks. And the next question is, what parts of organizations are most starved for innovation, and what strategic tools do you use to show value and impact?
The most starved for innovation. It depends on the type of innovation you're looking at, right? So I look at things like the work a receptionist does. Could we make that job somewhat automated and provide the person who sits there with some more challenging work? But that goes all the way up to, say in our firm, a managing partner, where the innovation that would be most impactful to him or her might be something that, you tap a device on your desktop, it automatically enters a billing description on your in your billing pro forma. So it really depends from which lens you're looking at kind of the need for innovation.
Thank you. And I guess this is the last question that has been posted. So if you could invest $1 million in an innovation bucket, what would you invest in?
That's a good question. I think, I'll be selfish because it's something I'm interested in. would be really almost a shared business intelligence platform that, again, anonymized, kind of not privileged information in a way that allowed information to be shared across organizations. And I see that outside of law. I see it in other places where anything you're doing in the organization is sort of trapped there. And you have people, and we do this ourselves, you may have 20 or 30 people, you know, in any given department who are sitting there trying to solve a problem. Or you're trying to figure out, you know, projecting for e-discovery how much data you're going to get over time and how that's going to be utilized. If we had a system like that in a data warehouse that was anonymized, you could then have metrics that are shared industry-wide that are not, because I will tell you, I go back and I look at the metrics in my own industry, and some of them are darn made up. It's just, you know, somebody sat down on a spreadsheet, typed in some numbers, and they don't mean anything. So getting to a point where we have data we can trust, at least within law, is where I would put my money.
Thank you. And thank you very much again, Dr. Billings, for accepting to be our speaker tonight. And if there isn't any more questions, we can conclude this webinar event.
Great.
Thank you all for joining this webinar, and have a good evening all.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.